All right, so learning objective 2, and just see here. Okay, thank you for the little bit of noise there. You want to put your microphones on. I'm saying off, please. All right, so we're going to learn basically how that process cost flow works for a manufacturing company that uses this. Okay. So one of the best ways to learn is to jump right into an example. And so Tyler Company here, they manufacture both rollerblades and skateboard wheels, okay, that it sells to manufacturers and retailers. And here is the issue, right? It consists of two processes. First is the machining, and then it's the assembly. The machining department shapes, hones, and drills the raw materials. And then the assembly department assembles and packages the parts, okay? So this is what Tyler Company does, rollerblade and skateboard wheels. So look at the flow. Look at the bottom here, this illustration. Here's the flow. We are all starting at the same point. We have our manufacturing costs in terms of raw materials, factory labor, and overhead already determined here. So look what happens. The first thing we need to do is we're going to assign, since we actually have two different processes going on in two different departments, we are going to assign the appropriate materials, labor, and overhead to the machining department. But we also have to assign the appropriate amount over to the assembly department as well. Okay. Now, normally speaking, because this works as though you need to do the machining first, then the assembly second, whatever the machining department completes will need to be transferred over to the assembly department as well. Okay. So it's a little bit of an interesting flow. Once the assembly department is done with its work, then it becomes a finished good. And you'll see it in finished goods inventory. And once it's in finished goods inventory, it's available for sale to other businesses and will be eventually assigned to cost of goods sold. So this is a very important cost flow that illustration that you're going to need to know because we're going to be doing it. Okay. So the first thing is like any other job. We are going to start with so much in raw materials inventory based on how much we purchase for our materials. We are going to start off with certain factory labor that we will incur. And we're going to start off with a certain amount of manufacturing overhead for those overhead costs that we incur. So everything starts the same way, regardless of the process system that they use, right? The flow. So after this, then we start assigning the raw materials, the factory labor, and the overhead to whatever the work in process is. And again, the work in process is usually, in this case that you saw with the other company, broken into the departments, right? So the first thing first, we have materials that need to be requisitioned and assigned. So the journal entry to record those materials would be a debit to work in process in the machining department, a debit to work in process for the assembly department, and of course, a credit to the raw materials inventory because that is being assigned to each of these two departments, right? So this numbers sort of broken up into what needs to be in the machining department when we start that process and how much needs to be in the assembly department when this whole thing starts. Okay. The next thing is factory labor costs. Again, you already know about time tickets and so forth. But the entry to get that going, again, looks very similar, right? We have a debit to work in process in the machining department and a debit to the assembly department, which is our total the factory labor here that's being allocated to each department. Okay. And then we have our manufacturing overhead costs. Now, the costs usually revolve around what we call a primary driver. Okay. So, what is the activity that is the primary cause of the costs in our overhead? And that's usually how we allocate it. And we're going to be learning a little bit more about that as well. So here we have, again, the same type of thing. We need to allocate a certain amount of the overhead to machining department, a certain amount to the assembly department, and of course we will credit our manufacturing overhead because that is being distributed here. Okay. So that's that first piece that you already kind of know about. Again, I like these little stories here. This one's from Caterpillar. Caterpillar basically has automated a lot of things. And so basically they really use robotic machines to do a lot of the work. And they only really need one person who tends to all those types of machines, right? So when you're talking about overhead, what's the primary cost? Well, it certainly wouldn't be direct labor, right? Primary cost would basically need to be specific to perhaps machine hours or things like that. So you're going to see how they choose a cost driver will depend on the processes that are involved. And all right, so again, everything starts with allocating the materials, labor, and overhead. But then every month, you're going to need to make sure that goods that have been completed in assembly, for example, has been moved to whatever the second department is. Machining over to assembly, right? So here we have a debit to work in process in the assembly department. Where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from the machining department. So this sort of transfers the goods from the machining department over to the assembly department. So now they're sitting in the assembly department. Okay. After assembly is done, of course, they're ready to be put into finished goods. And so we need a journal entry to move that. And so you're going to see a debit to finished goods inventory showing an increase in finished goods. Where are they coming from? They're coming from work in process in the assembly department moving over. And then, of course, once those finished goods are sold to customers, we can go ahead and record the cost of goods sold, which is an expense. So you'll see the debit side here, and finished goods inventory is where that came from. Right? That's what they sold. So you're going to see these transfers happening over and over again, and that's a big part of what this objective is about. So lo and behold, we are already at the do it exercise for objective 2. We're going to look at Blue Diamond Company, and they produce what's called Zibo, and they do that by 2 processes. There's the blending and there's the bottling. Okay, so again, that's the processes. So they need raw materials. So in June, raw materials for blending were 18,000. Raw materials for bottling were 4,000. We had factory labor for blending was 12, for bottling was 5,000. And of course, we had overhead costs for blending was 6, bottling was 2,500. Okay. So that's important information because that's what we are going to see. That's what we're going to repeat in this part of the chapter, right? Assigning the costs to each department. And then, of course, at the end of that month, the company is going to transfer units from blending to bottling. So we're going to have to record that as well, right? And then, of course, the bottling department, once they're done, will transfer that to finished goods. So you see how the whole process is sort of working out. So again, they want you to journalize all of these obviously one step at a time. So again, the first step is raw materials. We have basically assigned 18,000 of raw materials to blending, 4,000 of raw materials to bottling, and so our raw materials inventory saw a decrease of $22,000, which is why it's on the credit side. Factory labor, we assigned 12,000 of that to blending, 5,000 of that to bottling. And so we had a $17,000 credit to factory labor because that was allocated to the work in process for each department. And of course, for overhead, we had 6,000 of overhead for blending, 2,500 for bottling. All of that was the overhead that was allocated to each department. So now that the department, one department is done and transferring it to the another department, how does that look? Well, again, um, your problem says $19,000 of inventory was moved from blending to bottling. So there you see bottling department work in process is going up by 19,000 on the debit side, whereas blending is decreasing because they're moving it from blending to bottling. Once bottling is done, it's time to move it over to finished goods. And so they had $11,000 of finished goods that were ready. Finished goods inventory gets the debit of 11,000. Where did that come from? The bottling department, work in process bottling. We'll see that decrease by 11,000. And that's what they wanted you to do for that. So I'm going to stop that, bring us back to the screen and ask for any questions on that. How'd that